and welcome to a very special cross-continental episode of Fossil versus Future and Bula COP31. I'm Daisy.
And I'm James.
And for those of you joining us for the first time, Fossil versus Future is a warm conversation between generations on climate change. James is my godfather, and in each episode we tackle a different what about question related to climate that we are all familiar with from our conversations. What about AI? What about China? What about fossil fuels? We want to use intergenerational dialogue as a tool to learn, inspire, and get stuff done. But today, we're going bigger. We're here in our London studio, but we're virtually joined by our friends Jack and Heidi, hosts of podcast Bula COP31, who are on the other side of the world in Australia. With Australia taking the role of president of the COP31 negotiations, Jack and Heidi reached out with the great idea to join forces for a multilateral, intergenerational podcast. Hi, Jack and Heidi.
Thanks, James and Daisy. It's a great pleasure to join you. And thanks for having us in this existential episode of our podcast. I am Jack Whelan, and I am the fossil in our podcast. And my co-host, Heidi, just like you, Daisy, she represents a generation that is definitely the future. Bula, Heidi.
G'day, Jack, and g'day, James and Daisy. I'm Heidi Dumesich, and like Jack, I'm in Sydney. But don't be fooled by my accent. I did grow up in the United States, but I am Australian. I work here in the corporate sector in infrastructure sustainability, which is a mixture of climate, policy, ESG, carbon accounting, and reporting. So our podcast was originally called G'day COP31 last year when Australia was bidding to host the annual UN Conference of Parties, or the COP, which is supposed to be in Adelaide this November. But Jack, can you describe to the crew why we transitioned from G'day COP31 to Bula COP31?
Yeah, sure. I'm also sure that most of our listeners probably know that the final decision on the COP venue means that it will actually not be in Adelaide, but in Antalya in Türkiye, while the Australian Federal Minister, Chris Bowen's role will be, as Daisy said, the president of the UN negotiations leading up to the COP. And Australia, in keeping faith with its proposed previous regional partnership with the Pacific Island countries in hosting the COP, Pacific, as we know, are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The Pacific pre-COP31 event will be held in Fiji in October. So we adopted the Fijian word for G'day and renamed the podcast Bula COP31. And this is to focus on both Australia and the Pacific, with the whole COP31 coming up in November. And I'd just like to point out I'm wearing my Bula shirt from Fiji because this is, of course, business attire in the Pacific.
Love it.
James, look, if I could perhaps kick us off with the first question. Heidi calls you and me veterans of the COP. And you and I first met years ago when I used to organise the bingo delegations, the business and industry NGOs. We know all the stakeholder groups have names like Youngos and Ringos and Engos. But James, your experience goes back a lot further to the earliest days of the UN process. And we want to hear from you about how it all started. You brought all the Pacific Islands together in one of the early negotiating blocks at the COP, the AOSIS Alliance. We want to know, how did you actually do that? What was your role? And give us the backstory.
Well, it starts before the COPs even existed. So it starts with a legal opinion I wrote for Greenpeace as a young academic and barrister, which considered the possibility of bringing a case before the International Court of Justice against the United States of America for failure to act on climate change in 1988. And that work set out principles in international law of state responsibility that could be actionable, but where it was highly unlikely the US would submit to the jurisdiction of the International Court, and where the arguments for an international treaty to be negotiated seemed better than a piece of litigation. And so we colleagues of mine got together and produced a convention in draft form. We imagined what an international treaty would look like. And then we thought who would benefit most from such an agreement and who could, in a sense, represent all of us by having interests that were most affected by climate change, but had the least political and economic resources to deal with that vulnerability, and whose hope, if you like, rested with an effective international agreement on climate change. And we thought of low-lying developing states, and in particular the island nations of the world. And through relationships that we had, through academic connections at Cambridge, and then through students that we had taught that went to the UN, we set about going to events that gathered together political forces in regions where the island states were present, including, in my case, going to the South Pacific Forum, which happened to be in Vanuatu that year in Port Vila, and then making the case to representatives of the islands that an international treaty was possible and that they could organize around this draft agreement that we had come up with. So we could set out, these are the essential principles that should be in it, but actually this is what it could look like, and you could argue for this. And bit by bit, they rallied around that. And so, for example, the South Pacific Forum was a precursor to the first real gathering of all the small island states in the Second World Climate Conference in November 1990 in Geneva. And that's when they learned that they could collaborate together. Their voices could be combined. There's a good passage in Jeremy Leggett's book, The Carbon War, which describes what happened when they first had that experience. And it was all actually around the precautionary principle, something I had written about and advocated for. And you had this feeling, if you imagine a kind of banked negotiating room where the island voices were heard in concert for the first time. And they felt some power in that, individually powerless, but collectively they could organize around these principles. And it worked. They were effective. And they got the precautionary principle, in this instance, into the policy declaration in the Second World Climate Conference. And that paved the way to the first negotiating process, which began in Chantilly, Virginia in February 1991. And that was, those were called the INCs. That was what led up to the agreement that was finally adopted in June 92, actually quite a quick negotiating process, at the Earth Summit in Rio in Brazil. So the Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed in June 92, and I think we had about, so I'm guessing now, I'm trying to remember, 39, 40, maybe 41 countries in that coalition then under the Alliance of Small Island States, which is a big number in the UN system. I think there might have been about 175, 180 states at that stage. And for good or ill, one country, one vote in the UN system, trying to build consensus, it made a big difference to have a coalition of small island states.
James, we often talk about, you've mentioned power, and we often talk about power as a theme on Fossil versus Future, but you built AOSIS as a group of young, idealistic lawyers with little formal power, really, at that stage in your career. How did you and your team manage to build real negotiating leverage in such a entrenched multilateral system?
It's true that I've said before, and I kind of really mean it, I hope this comes across, especially to younger folk, actually naivety helped. Not knowing why not helped. What we were doing really wasn't done. And grown-up senior diplomats were quite happy to tell us that. But I think also, again, I don't want to stretch the point, but if you had a look at who the individuals were that were performing the role of advisors and negotiators on behalf of this coalition that we built, there was an intergenerational element there. We were kids. We were younger than you are now, right? we had good credentials. We had been well educated in international law. We felt confident in our knowledge. And in a sense, it was a new subject. So you could be a kid and say, I know about international environmental law. And a generation before would say, well, what is that exactly? Right? And so we had some confidence that we were making something fresh based on principles long established, but actually even not that long established, because the modern version of international law is really post-Nuremberg, there's plenty of history behind it, but the idea of international law forming an international institution, which in turn had a kind of quasi-legislative function for the world, a relatively modern idea, and to direct it towards environmental issues was new. But we were advocates for that, so we felt confident in the new subject. But we brought in to help this coalition, which is all philanthropically funded.
Wow.
I can't believe how we did it with so little. We used senior partners in law firms that wanted to contribute. We took advice from eminent professors who were interested in using their knowledge and capabilities to help solve a problem. And we, as a group, we were all young international lawyers trying to make a contribution, and had people who were interns from law firms or our students, because we were teaching the first specialist master's course in international environmental law at that time, and we had people who were very keen to help.
There's so much that can actually shape climate negotiations. I've never been to a COP, but I'd love to understand how much of the geopolitics actually shapes climate diplomacy in ways that us, the public, don't really see day to day.
Yeah. So there are always multiple negotiations going on inside and around what are already probably, I would argue, the most complex international negotiations that we have ever had. The subject matter itself is complicated. The system we're dealing with is huge, diverse, and very hard to intervene in a useful way to solve the problem. And there are many, many economic issues, obviously vested interests that are hard to move, even when you've got some momentum in the climate negotiations. So you frequently come up against another issue that is more immediate, it seems more important to the players at that moment, which they either have a political constituency to fight, or they're just not used to elevating the climate issue above that one, which might be trade or energy or a boundary or border dispute or war, as what we're experiencing right now. So climate is always facing this really strong pressure to resist being set aside for something more immediate, a felt risk that is more in your face, more associated with a human being's fight or flight instinct than the kind of long unfolding of a serious problem from many directions over a generation or two. And so all negotiations have these parallel elements that you have to deal with. And I would say just two things about that, however. One of the things I learned early on, partly by doing it, but partly by noticing who was making things move in the negotiations, is that individuals matter. No matter how big the process, you've got all these states sitting behind their country flags with positions that they adopt that have been pre-agreed before they arrive, with the potential at any one moment to call back to capital to check that they're staying within the mandate they were given when they went to the negotiations. Despite all of that and the massive difference in power between countries, I mean, I sat on the Vanuatu delegation next to the United States of America. You couldn't imagine a bigger difference. But nonetheless, individuals matter. You see who's making the process work. You see who's committed to the process as a whole, in addition to their country position. You see who cares about the outcome as much as they do about defending a national position. And one of the things that is quite difficult to make happen, but is essential, is that the process understands for this problem, the I win, you lose negotiating strategy, which might work in another context, doesn't work here. There isn't an I win, you lose outcome to the climate problem. It's irrelevant. So if you have an experienced negotiator who's practiced in that technique and who thinks there is a national position that is set against another one that is superior to figuring out how to solve the problem, they're actually going to get in the way. Whereas there might be another negotiator, and it might be that they're younger, or it might be that they just have really got this issue, who will transcend the position they came with, and they will try hard, they'll put effort in to figuring out how you get more out of this process that solves a problem. And then you have to cope with the fact that that might be defeated by some brute power at a later stage, and we have all had that experience too.
So, James, let's fast forward a bit to COP23, when Fiji was occupying the position of the COP presidency. Although the COP wasn't hosted in the Pacific, it was hosted in Bonn for practical reasons. But nevertheless, Fiji was the president of the COP. Now, you were directly involved in the Fiji COP,
Yes.
and you were advising the Fiji Prime Minister and writing speeches and doing all sorts of amazing things. What I'd like to know a little bit more about is your experience and what lessons maybe there are for COP presidencies in how the COP president is important in influencing the outcomes or not, as the case may be. What's the role of the president of the negotiations?
Well, it's very important to make a distinction right away and to fully understand what it means for your country, for your civil service, for the enterprises that gather around the presidency to press their interests, that the president is the president of a multilateral process whose principal duty is to steer, guide the process towards an outcome. Sometimes a mandate is handed on. It's quite explicit. The presidency has the role to deliver this at the end of the year. Sometimes it's a little bit more open. There's not a particular moment that needs to be reduced to, there's not a significant milestone or a particular treaty amendment that's in play. But in every instance, the president's principal duty is to the whole, not to their individual nation. And so delegations generally split between the presidency team and the national team. And so you carry on having civil servants representing the national interest behind their country flag. But the presidency operates in service of the whole of the international community, for all of the parties. So that's very important to get. The second thing, and it was very obvious with when Fiji had the presidency, is that there is a huge obligation to put on a successful event. And the most successful events connect the multilateral process with other interests that are important in the delivery and in the achievement of an outcome, and also in the representation of civil society and of industry and of business and of investment and all the various other ways in which the climate change issue is manifested in other people's efforts beyond the diplomatic process. And I would say one more element that you could judge an effective presidency is, can the president make a connection between domestic politics, the political economy of the place that holds the presidency, and the multilateral process? Can a connection be made for these big issues with something that resonates in the culture, politics, and economy of the host, if you like? And when that happens, you have an extra benefit from being president. And it really helps to know how you would do that, or what the issues are that would resonate well. And I think we did a reasonable job during the Fiji presidency, but of course, Fiji was not able to host the whole event, and Germany, and perhaps more accurately, Germany as the host of the Secretariat of the Framework Convention in Bonn, provided a place and the capacity to do the negotiations in Bonn. Actually was quite a useful host venue. They tried very hard to make it easy for Fiji to perform their task as president. But what we also want to do is to bring Fiji, including, shirts like yours, Jack, to Bonn. So we made a huge effort to bring the Pacific to Bonn in the design and the way we laid things out, and in raising issues that were relevant to the Pacific, lots more focus on the oceans. We even used some of the ideas that have long established in the Pacific for how you resolve conflicts, how you bring people together and learn and listen and take account of people's differences and arrive at a conclusion that can suit very deliberately the interests of generations unborn. That was part of the Talanoa idea that we brought to the negotiations, and I'd like to think that helped. And other presidencies since have tried to copy or learn from that, bringing their own idea of how in their society and culture complex problems are resolved, try and improve little by little the way the process works. Yeah, I think we did okay. But it's very obvious the gap in capacity to implement from a single small line. You do really need to find ways of collaborating. We also did things that I thought were quite relevant, still are. For example, we issued a bond on the London Stock Exchange that had a climate theme, but was actually focused on basic infrastructure, Heidi, of trying to get the Suva's wastewater system to be resilient to climate change. It was a very sensible, quite prosaic, but very important requirement for capital. And we used the process to help raise the profile, and we got capital we would not otherwise have got but for being president of the process. And so I was pleased that we were able to do things like that too.
James, from your experience advising various COP presidencies, including Fiji, Kyoto Protocol, AOSIS, Rio Earth Summit, how do you think, the setup's going to be slightly different this year, but how do you think the Pacific Islands can leverage the COP31 process this year?
Well, the first thing is they can. Some of this is just to do with how consensus gets built. We've talked before in our podcast, I'm sure you have too, about how the system works on consensus. Mm-hmm. And consensus is not unanimity, which we've also discussed before. That's often how you get a decision, is you recognize that there may be somebody who's still disagreeing, but you have consensus in the room, and it has to be built. And numbers matter, but so does rhetoric. So does the advocacy you do outside the negotiations, the support you can get from powerful interests beyond your own individual state. Always you have to find interests that transcend your particular grouping. So within the UN system, there are various groupings associated with your geography, but then interest groups form. And you've no doubt heard of phrases like coalition of the willing, and people form coalitions over particular issues. And you need to have a group that can move the consensus, that can get support from across the spectrum of interests at the negotiations. And the small island states can do that, and the Pacific states will be able to have a very particular platform this year, and they should use it. They should absolutely use it. They should organize within the Pacific. They should make use of their relationships outside the Pacific, and they should use as much leverage as they could possibly get from civil society, from the media, from ways in which pressure can be brought to bear on the more powerful interests that they have to get on side in order to get an agreement that's adequate for their own concerns. But again, just want to emphasize, the Pacifics, the small island states in total, they represent all of our interests. They're just a more extreme version of it in the sense their vulnerability is more obvious than ours, but their interests are ours wherever you are in the world. And I know this sounds obvious again, but had we followed the interests of the small island states all those years ago, we would be in better shape, all of us, right? So the Pacifics have got a voice, use it. I would say another thing about the difference amongst the small island states, the Pacifics were often quite reticent to use their voice. It was often a quiet voice, sometimes quite fatalistic, quite accepting of their situation. It took a long time, really, before they could build up the confidence to say, no, actually, we really, really mean this. And I thought some of the other island states were quite helpful. The Caribbeans were articulate, sometimes quite forceful. Their voice resonated, I think, better earlier than the Pacifics. But I would like to think now, I'd hope now, that we're better literally tuned in to how they speak. You know, it's a different form of rhetoric. You sometimes see it, I know you know this, but it's quite poetic. There's a way of talking the Pacific. Some of it is infused with religious belief. Some of it is infused with mythology that's been passed on through generations amongst the islands. But I find some of the most effective communication is very poetic. It's rather beautiful to listen to, but you have to really listen. It's not as aggressive, it's not as demanding as some of the other forms of rhetoric from other parts of the world. And somehow or other we have to use that carefully and effectively to change minds and to arrive at the right, if you like, consciousness for the need to act that these negotiations represent.
Yeah, that's really powerful, the use of language and how they speak and actually listening. So, yeah, very interesting. But we're moving into I'm really interested in the COP as a beast because it's gotten so big. It's not just about the negotiations anymore. There's pavilions, side events, and it's a show almost.
Yeah.
So do you feel like potentially it might be time to reform the entire process? And if you did think it's time to reform the COP, what would that look like? What would you like the change to look like with the COP process?
Wow, Heidi, that's a big one, and I think we should come back to it. And you and Daisy in particular should, in a sense, have the strongest voice on what the future should look like. But yes, it does need to be reformed. It's needed to be reformed for a long time. But I'm just going to try and emphasize the need for that reform to happen in a way that validates the multilateral process rather than undermines it. There will continue to be a need for the world to gather in all of its voices, however small or politically powerless, in order to grapple with a problem that affects all of humanity and all the other species that occupy this planet. We should be gathering as a whole and doing our very best to figure out how to do that, right? Without forming a global government, without pretending everybody does have the same power to implement, but by insisting that everybody has the right to be heard, and to be heard with their interest expressed in their own way at a particular moment in a calendar of political events, and with the possibility of the law and the rule of law being the friend of the weak against the strong. that has to be argued for, protected, defended against those who I could agree with when they say we need to change the system, but where I have suspicions that they're not going to do enough to protect that, which has real value. Okay, so we do need to gather. We do need a multilateral process. We do need the rule of law to protect the weak against the strong, but we also need an effective regime that recognizes that you need power to make changes in the world, including economic power, technological power, the power of movements, including movements of the youth. And so we can break bits off where we can be better at focus and delivery and an outcome that can be measured and reported on, that can be translated into action at many levels of our economy and society. So I'm very much in favor of taking parts of the problem and connecting them to keeping them connected to the multilateral process, but finding smaller groups of countries that can act, and then very deliberately locking on to domestic law, domestic implementation, using the power of cities, using the power of private groups of strong interest in key sectors, making sure that if there's a set of solutions that's particularly available to the cement industry, the steel industry, the chemical industry, then we look to how they could be implemented at a faster rate. Yeah, there's more we could talk about, but that is my firm conviction that we have to celebrate multilateralism whilst we recognize its limitations and find ways of organizing behavior, particularly lawmaking behavior. And I'm sure that's to do with my roots in the law, but I genuinely think that it's a set of powers that best offers the world, and indeed the interests that can't speak. We've talked before about the rights of nature and the ways in which we've invent representation of those that can't represent themselves in order to better respond to the real-world facts of climate change.
Well, James, and as you know, the intergovernmental climate negotiations have faced serious challenges in the past. It's not the first time that we're in this sort of period of doubt around whether the process needs reform. One period that I'm thinking of particularly was following Kyoto in 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was very slow to be ratified, and it was delayed. Its entry into force was very delayed as a result of that failure of certain countries to ratify it. I'm thinking of the United States, for example, and Australia, who refused to ratify it, and it took quite a long time until 2007. It was the year that I actually returned to Australia from Europe, on the very week that Kevin Rudd was elected as the new Prime Minister of Australia on behalf of the Labor Party. And he announced very quickly that Australia's decision to ratify Kyoto, and he would take that support to the COP31 in Bali. And actually, the US shifted its stance marginally also to join the consensus on the Bali Action Plan. So that's setting the scene for the last question from me is, how significant do you think the USA withdrawal from the UNFCCC Paris Agreement is to the whole process?
Of course, it's significant. I mean, it's taken a critical actor out of the process, and it encouraged those that follow that political ideology to be disruptive and to find ways of limiting the effectiveness of an agreement that was already struggling to be effective. However, as happened post-Kyoto, what other countries choose to do in response can sometimes help So the world has already absorbed the US withdrawal and carried on doing what it was already doing. It may not be enough, but the momentum has not stopped in the actions of the vast majority, the most of the world that we've described, not as opposed to the rest of the world. The most of the world has carried on doing what they can in their own jurisdiction. We also know, of course, that within the United States of America, there are strongly differing points of view, and many of the states, many of the most important and powerful economies within the United States of America are continuing to act on climate. And then there's all the sorts of things that we should talk about more and when we next meet, which is how the set of technologies and enterprises that have solutions to the climate problem are also just pushing on regardless of the political stance taken by this administration in the US at this point in time. And you could see that with the continuing growth of renewables in the States, notwithstanding the point of view expressed by the president and those who are now in the key positions of power in that administration. So there's no point in belittling the consequence, the significance of a US withdrawal. It absolutely doesn't help, but it doesn't hinder enough what is happening politically and economically. And the suite of responses to climate change that we know already make economic sense have enough of their own momentum that they also will not be deflected by that decision to withdraw from the climate negotiations.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi and Jack. This has been great, and I think we're going to need a part 2.
We are going to need a part 2. We are definitely going to need a part 2.
Oh, yeah, so thanks so much for joining us on this part 1. And in the second part, we'll be focusing on the future, Daisy and I, to kind of frame what we want to see from COP31. There's a lot of things that came out of COP30, such as the Blem Declaration on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and also some conferences that are happening in April with that treaty. And that's something we're going to unpack, Daisy and I, in the next episode.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things going on in the world right now that will really impact those events as well. So interested for us to chat more about how those events are going to be affecting the lead up to COP31 and the pre-event in the Pacific as well.
Well,
Looking
and
forward
also
to seeing
I would like to thank James particularly for being in the hot seat tonight and giving us all the benefit of his tremendous experience and insights. And as you say, for our next episode, we can hand over to Heidi and Daisy to get their insights on what's going to be obviously a very difficult year ahead in world affairs.
Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Thank you so much for listening to Fossil vs. Future. Please subscribe to our podcast and give us a rating. And please follow us on social media. Let us know the what about questions that you want us to discuss.